I have the daunting task tonight of presenting to you 2,000 years of liturgical history in a half an hour. Now, the good news is there were centuries where nothing happened. And the bad news is that oftentimes when things happened, nobody left any documentary evidence, so we're not exactly sure why things happened when they did. We're always kind of looking backwards into developments in liturgy. But it's important for us to know that liturgy from day one, from the Last Supper to today, always develops. There's always change, there's always things added, because times change, people change, language change. So it's good for us to kind of take a look. And yet, through all the changes, it's also the same. And so we're going to look at that too. When Jesus goes to feed the 5,000, the language that is used is Eucharistic language. He takes the bread, he blesses the bread, he breaks the bread, he gives the bread. And that is always Eucharistic language. Not to say that those feeding were Eucharists, but they were symbols of what the Eucharist is, of Jesus, of God, feeding his people in a miraculous way. The Last Supper was connected to the Passover. So there is a connection to our Jewish brothers and sisters and their story of salvation, of being led from slavery into freedom. And Jesus becoming our Passover, leading us from the slavery of sin into freedom. And Jesus makes this connection by celebrating this Passover with his disciples and taking the old covenant and making it a new covenant. And there's always that connection. And we always, when we celebrate the Eucharist, are celebrating our Christian Passover, never forgetting that we stand in the long line of thousands of years of people of faith who believe that God delivers us from sin and slavery into freedom. This bread and wine that he gives to his disciples, which is his body and blood, given for you, shed for you, shed not at the Last Supper, but at the cross. And so for Jesus, not only are we bringing the Passover forward, but he's also bringing the cross into this meal that he shares with his disciples. And he says to his disciples, "Do this in memory of me," which is why we have a Mass. Because, a young person asked me recently, I was out at the National Catholic Youth Conference in Columbus with 23,000 teenagers. And one of the teenagers in our group from our parish, as we were walking from one thing to another, said, "Can I ask you a question, Father?" Sure. If faith is defined as doing righteous deeds, why do we have to go to Mass? And I said, well, I have two responses to you. One, maybe going to Mass is one of those righteous deeds. But I think the most important thing is because he asked us to. He said, "Do this in memory of me." As we've come together for Eucharist for 2,000 years, we are certainly remembering a historical event, the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But we do it, it's not just a remembrance of a past event. When we're at Mass, we are participating in that sacrifice again. That meal that Jesus shared with his disciples, that death on the cross, his resurrection on Easter, is happening again in our gathering. But it doesn't just stop there, because it propels us forward, back out into our daily lives, strengthened to live as Christ's body in the world. And so that's probably one of the most important things that we get from the Last Supper, this what Jesus means when he says, "Do this in memory of me." Because anytime Christians have gathered for the Eucharist, for what we call the Mass, they have been remembering, they have been having anamnesis, remembering Christ, and Christ becoming present, and Christ propelling us into the future. But we do know from the Acts of the Apostles that from the beginning, those who believed Jesus was the Messiah gathered. And they gathered on the first day of the week, Sunday. Now, in the earliest strata of the church, these were still practicing Jews. They still held Saturday as their Sabbath. They were centered in Jerusalem, so on the Sabbath they went to the temple, and they participated in Jewish prayer in the temple. But then, on Sunday, they met in their homes to remember the Lord and to break bread. Okay. So at the very earliest strata of the church, when it's still really a sect within, a movement within Judaism, they're kind of worshiping 2 days a week. They're kind of worshiping the old way on Saturday, and they're beginning to celebrate this new ritual on Sunday. Why? On Sunday. Come on.
The resurrection.
Resurrection, that's right. The 8th day, the first day of the new creation. So, the fact that our Sabbath has become Sunday finds its root right there. As the church moves away from being a primarily Jewish sect into its own religion, then the Jewish celebration of Saturday as our Sabbath falls away, and Sunday becomes the new Sabbath for the people of the new dispensation. But that's already begun when they're still considered, when Christians still consider themselves Jews. Again, we don't have a huge amount of information, but basically they shared a meal. And sometime during that meal, they would remember what Jesus did on the night before he died. And they would take bread, and they would bless it and break it and share it. And they would take wine, and they would bless it and share it among them, believing that when they did that, Christ was present with them. Okay? They would probably base this house gathering on the only other kind of religious gathering they knew, which would be the synagogue gathering. And so they would probably share Scripture. What Scripture would they have shared? The Old Testament. The New Testament hasn't been written yet. And they would reflect on that, and they would look probably into the Old Testament for the prophecies that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus, because they were themselves learning what it meant to be Christians. And liturgy and Eucharist for us has always been that. It's been a place where we learn how to be Christians, how to be followers of Jesus Christ. And again, by the time of Paul, we're not meeting. We're meeting in houses. There aren't church buildings yet, and yet persecutions are just beginning towards the end of Paul's life, so that there isn't necessarily a need to hide. The Christians are still pretty much out in the open, and yet they're suspect, because Sunday doesn't mean anything to anybody else. There's no such thing as a weekend in the ancient Roman world, and that these Christians take the first day of the week off and come together in a house to pray, and they don't participate in our pagan rituals, nor do they participate in a lot of our community gatherings, because most of our community gatherings stem from pagan rituals. There's some suspect that there's something wrong here. There's something different about these Christians. Not a bad thing to be called different as a Christian, but we know that led to some very difficult times for the early church. The next period of history I want to talk about is from the Apostles to Gregory the Great in the 7th century. Okay. This is where I say there are long periods of time where either nothing happens or we don't know why or when. And so this next period, there's only some vignettes that I need to go through that we hear about Eucharist.